Previously, we looked at the labor supply and an overview of it. We now turn to labor demand. So one of the more common things that people like to talk about is that athletes are quote-unquote overpaid. All right. But if you look at it, just the idea of being overpaid is drastically different from the idea of being paid a lot of money. Okay. And so if you look at the dynamics of labor supply and now labor demand, it'll show that many highly paid professional athletes are in fact underpaid, okay, under the more direct economic point of looking at it. So a couple assumptions. Assume that, for all firms, which sports teams are firms, they're producing an output using two broad inputs: capital, which is denoted by a K, and labor, which is an L. So also assume that the firm is operating in the short run. So if you remember the difference between short run and long run in economics, in the short run you have fixed costs, which we are assuming capital K is fixed. But in the economic long run, there are no fixed costs. Okay, so because we are assuming it's a short run, we are assuming that capital is fixed. So the only way that the firm can alter the amount of output, denoted by Q, is by changing the amount of labor they use. Now we're also going to assume the markets are perfectly competitive. I understand that this can not make sense based on what has been discussed in this course and in previous videos, but it just kind of put a framework together. So because, again, we're assuming the market is perfectly competitive, and so because of that, firms cannot affect the price of their output. So because of this, firms are going to maximize their profits, which one of the basic assumptions of economics is that the goal of firms is to maximize their profits, and they will do so by choosing labor to maximize difference between revenue and cost. So they're going to choose the amount of labor so that the resulting output results in the biggest difference between the revenue they're bringing in and the cost of production. Now, where does this happen? This occurs where the marginal revenue, which is the point where the additional revenue of additional worker, all right, so the marginal revenue from employing one more worker equals the marginal cost, the additional cost of that additional worker. Okay. So again, we're going to be simplifying things a little bit here, and we're going to ignore all employment costs except for the worker's pay. All right, and also assume that the marginal cost of one additional hour of labor is the worker's wage, which is W. So now let's talk about benefit. What's the benefit that you get from adding an additional worker? So the benefit of adding a worker is what is known as the marginal revenue product of labor. Right? So we're assuming the market is perfectly competitive, and when that's the case, the marginal revenue is going to be the same as the price that is determined by the market. Right? So the marginal revenue product of labor is going to equal the price times the marginal product of labor. And the marginal product of labor is the additional output that gets produced by employing additional unit of labor. And so if we look at that here, we have the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Now again, we know that the marginal revenue, because the market is competitive, is equal to the price times the marginal product of labor, which is the change in output, times the change in labor. So as an example, if adding each worker increases output by 20 units per hour, which can then be sold for $5 each, all right, that additional worker can add $100 per hour. So the marginal revenue product labor is $100 for that worker. Because if we look at this, the 20 units, all right, that's the quantity, that's the additional output, the change in Q, divided by the change in L, which is just 1, and the price is 5. So you have 5 times 20 divided by 1. All right, so 5 times 1 is 100. Okay. So what ends up happening is this just goes back to more your basic economic foundations. The marginal product labor falls as the labor input rises, and this is the diminishing marginal returns. And so because of this, you have that downward sloping demand curve. And so we have two figures here. So we have A and B. So A shows the marginal product of labor, marginal revenue product labor. And so it initially increases, gets to a point, L0, and then it declines. Okay, so that's the diminishing marginal product of labor. Now we can go ahead and do this by now looking at it as we would start with the labor demand curve at L0, all right, the point where it's at its peak. All right, so we're going from this one to this one, from A to B. All right, so we're starting right here. Okay. And then we're relabeling the graph so that the wage is on the vertical axis. So instead of the marginal revenue product labor, we have the wage. All right. And this is going to give the demand for labor. Okay. And so a couple reasons. So when the wage is, let's say, W1, right? So the wage equals the marginal revenue product labor at L1. So if the wage falls from W1 to W2, all right, so it's now, the firm now does not have to pay as much to the workers. The point to where they will be able to maximize their profits will be able to go up. And so they will then go to W equals the L2. Okay. So because of this, the demand of labor curve is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor starting at the point where the MRPL is maximized. Now, determining what a player is worth, determining their marginal revenue product labor is not an easy thing because these players do not operate in a vacuum. So Peyton Manning, for example, retired in 2016 as one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history and a two-time Super Bowl championship. His father, Archie Manning, owns the worst record among starting quarterbacks in the NFL history and threw 48 more interceptions than touchdowns. Okay. Now, this does not necessarily imply that Peyton was that much better than his father, because in football especially, a quarterback's performance depends on the rest of the team and coaching. And in each case, talking about the rest of the team and coaching, Peyton had better support than his father. Okay. So the interdependence of players on one another helps to explain why some standard metrics of performance are surprisingly unstable. So for example, in the NHL hockey, the save percentage and goals against average seems like an obvious way to evaluate a goalie. All right, so the more, the higher percentage of shots they stop, the better goalie they are. But if you look at the correlation of these measures across different seasons, there's not much. And so the bigger point is that these factors are a lot more. So even if they are, for example, say a player has a low save percentage, the team might be doing well because they're not giving up that many shots on goals. Okay. So one of the ways to kind of address this, so attempt to separate a player's performance from the conditions under which he plays. There's been a lot of video technology, big data, analytics, And these have been, the data analysis a lot of times have been used to evaluate a player's true impact. We talked previously about wins above replacement. All right, that's one way to look at it. So in baseball, for example, a lot of analysts have turned away from earned run average as a measure of pitching performance, because ERA can reflect fielding ability of other players. And so they've developed what are known as defense-independent pitching statistics, which you don't hear about too much, but it's been kind of moving towards that a little bit. So this is just a brief overview of the labor demand. In the next video, I will look at bringing together labor demand and labor supply, looking at the market equilibrium.